What exactly is so miraculous about wine? I found myself asking this question as I read the gospel text for this morning, a story that's familiar to me, and so I was looking for fresh insight. The problem that Jesus is asked to solve is a simple one. Jesus and his disciples and his mom are at a wedding, and they run out of wine. Now, Jesus doesn't want to get involved at first, but his mom is persistent. She believes that he can do something about it, and so she doesn't take no for an answer. Finally, he instructs some servants to take these jars, these stone jars that are around, that are there nearby, and to fill them with water. And then he instructs them to draw some out and to take it to the chief steward. And when the chief steward tastes what he has given, the water has become wine, he finds the bridegroom, and he's impressed. He says, "Most people would wait and serve the bad stuff at the end, but you have saved the best wine until now." But the servants know the truth, and so do the disciples. Through this miracle, through this sign, the glory of Jesus is revealed to them, and they believe. This passage from John's Gospel is familiar to me, but to be honest, I haven't heard many sermons about it. And if you, like me, grew up in the Free Methodist Church or another holiness denomination in which abstaining from alcohol was a big part of your theological identity, you might struggle a little bit to know how to make sense of this story. What do we do with a miracle story in which Jesus provides not just some alcohol, but an excessive amount of alcohol at a party where people had probably already had too much to drink? Not exactly an environment of moderation, let alone abstinence. As a former children's pastor, I can attest that the makers of children's curriculum also struggle to know how to talk about this story. I have a pastor friend who was in children's ministry for many years, and she shared with me that one curriculum she used referred to the wine as Jesus' special party juice. So that's one way to solve the awkwardness. Even if teetotaling isn't a part of your cultural or church background, you may be asking the same question that I did. What's so miraculous about wine? This is the inaugural act of Jesus' public ministry and the first of the 7 signs that he will perform in John's Gospel. And out of these 7 signs, which include events such as healing the paralyzed man at the pool, feeding the 5,000, walking on water, raising Lazarus from the dead, we might wonder why this sign is the one that comes first. The one that sets the tone for Jesus' identity and ministry as is portrayed in John's Gospel. No one's being healed. It's not a matter of life and death. They're just out of wine. But this story has a prominent place in John's Gospel, and it has a prominent place in worship throughout the history of the church. John 2, 1 through 11 was read on Epiphany in the ancient lectionaries of the church, and to this day, it's still an Epiphany reading in the Eastern Church. And for Roman Catholics and Protestants who use the Revised Common Lectionary, this text is a part of the Epiphany season for us too, coming up as the gospel reading on the second Sunday after the Epiphany every year C, which is where we are today. Through the gospel texts of the Epiphany season, we recognize and we celebrate specific events that manifest the divinity of Jesus. And throughout the history of the church, this particular story, where Jesus turns water into wine, has been included in that list. Of course, in the Gospel of John, things are never just what they seem. Even the miracles are more than just miracles. By calling them signs, John puts extra weight behind these acts of power. They point to something beyond themselves. They point to the identity and to the mission of Christ. The final verse of today's gospel reading helps us understand what is at stake in this story. Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. This act of turning water into wine is more than just an impressive party trick. It points to something deeper. Remember the prologue from John 1? "And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory. The glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth." The wedding at Cana is a snapshot or a glimpse of this glory. It shows us something significant about who Christ is and why he has come. So let's consider together today what the story reveals to us about Christ and his glory. When you read the story carefully, there's no denying that abundance is the point. 6 stone jars that can hold 20 to 30 gallons of water each. That's 180 gallons of wine. The sheer amount of it is almost ridiculous. Who needs that much wine? But this isn't a story of just enough, it's a story of more than enough. Not only does Jesus make a lot of wine, but Jesus makes really good wine. As the steward observed, when you're nearing the end of a several day long wedding celebration, people aren't as particular about the quality of what they're eating and drinking. Their senses are dulled. You could even argue that the wine that Jesus makes will be wasted on this group of people because they won't fully appreciate how good it is. But Jesus gives them good wine anyway, because God is a God of abundance. In John 10, Jesus says to his disciples, "I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." Abundant life and abundant grace. I think of another part of John's prologue. From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. When Jesus turns the water into wine, he does this as an act of radical provision and generosity. There's nothing stingy or measured about the love of God. And the life that Christ brings, as we see symbolized here in the wine, as we see symbolized in images of bread given to the crowd of 5,000, and the living water that Jesus describes to the Samaritan woman at the well. This life doesn't end. It doesn't run out. It's not exclusive or offered to only a few. There is more than enough for all who desire it. In this miraculous act, we also see a God who is able to provide for our needs. It's tempting to be dismissive of this miracle because, quite frankly, wine isn't a need. Not in the same way that food is for the crowd of 5,000, for example. And when his mother first approaches him about the lack of wine, Jesus' response to her, "What is that to you and me?" reveals a kind of detachment or dismissal, even, that we might think is appropriate for this situation. But it's helpful to remember the ways in which their cultural context differed from ours. This was not a Saturday night wedding reception at the Hilton Hotel with an open bar. The Jewish wedding celebrations that Jesus attended could last up to 7 days, and sometimes guests would only come for a part of that 7-day celebration, making it difficult for the host to anticipate how much food and wine would need to be provided for this occasion. It was often customary for wedding guests to bring food and drink as a gift, to share the burden of providing for a group of that size. So for the bridegroom to run out of wine would have caused him and his family a great amount of embarrassment, perhaps even indicating a lack of community support, because those who had been invited to the wedding hadn't done their part to help contribute food and drink that was needed for this many people. Jesus' act of provision here, as Lindsay Jodry calls it, is a sign of shared hospitality. Jesus demonstrates not only his care, but also his ability to provide. No matter our need, no matter the situation, Christ is the one who can take jars of water and turn them into the finest wine. In both the ordinary and extraordinary moments of our lives, Christ demonstrates that he cares for our needs and is more than able to provide for them. Jesus' miraculous acts at the wedding at Cana also shows us that God's kingdom is one of celebration and joy. Although John's gospel doesn't use the phrase kingdom of heaven or kingdom of God in the same way that other gospels do, it's clear that the signs that John's gospel writes of, are meant to give a vision of what God's kingdom is like. This imagery of God's kingdom as a wedding banquet is reinforced in John the Baptist's words about Jesus when he says, "He who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice." And the wine imagery specifically calls to mind examples from the Old Testament where an abundance of good wine is a symbol of God's coming salvation and the joy that will accompany it. The prophet Amos speaks of the day when the mountains shall drip sweet wine and all the hills shall flow with it. And in Isaiah, we read about the feast that God prepares for all peoples, a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines strained clear. The promise isn't just for the people of Israel, but for all peoples. The image of people filled with rejoicing when they come together in celebration around a table that's filled with good food and wine, is an image of the rejoicing that will be present in God's kingdom, when God's salvation is fully realized. In God's kingdom, there is enough for all and room for all, and this is what Christ bears witness to. What we also see revealed here in this miraculous act at the wedding at Cana is the Christ who is the Lord of all creation. John's gospel is very clear about Jesus' identity from the start. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. Jesus turns water into wine and walks on water and heals the sick and raises the dead because, as creator, all things have been made by him and are under his authority. I love what C.S. Lewis has to say about this in his book Miracles. He writes, God creates the vine and teaches it to draw up water by its roots, and with the aid of the sun to turn that water into a juice which will ferment and take on certain qualities. Thus, every year from Noah's time till ours, God turns water into wine. That men fail to see. Either like the pagans, they refer the process to some finite spirit, Bacchus or Dionysus, or else like the moderns, they attribute real and ultimate causality to the chemical and other material phenomena, which are all that our senses can discover in it. But when Christ at Cana makes water into wine, the mask is off. The miracle has only half its effect. If it only convinces us that Christ is God, it will have its full effect if, whenever we see a vineyard or drink a glass of wine, we remember that here works he who sat at the wedding party in Cana. In this act of turning water into wine, we are reminded that nothing is too difficult for the Lord of all creation, the one through whom all things were made. Another thing I find noteworthy about this story is that even though the purpose of this first sign performed by Jesus is to reveal his glory, only a handful of people seem to be in possession of all the facts, allowing them to recognize this truth. The steward, not knowing where the wine has come from, tastes it and assumes that the bridegroom has simply set aside the best wine for last, and no details are given about the wedding party or the guests. We can only assume that they're kept in the dark too. But Mary and the servants and the disciples, they're in on the secret. The servant's response isn't recorded, and neither is Mary's, but she's already displayed a great amount of faith, so I don't think it came as a big surprise to her. At the end of the story, it's the disciples' reaction that says it all. When they see the glory of Jesus revealed, they respond with belief. As Pastor Barb reminded us last week in her sermon, epiphanies abound, and when you are expectant, you see them. So as we reflect on this miracle of Jesus turning water into wine, we ask ourselves this question. When God's glory is revealed to us, how will we respond? Will we recognize God's glory in the faces of people who are around us, and in God's presence and comfort in the midst of painful circumstances? Will we recognize God's glory in the form of answered prayer, in acts of mercy and justice and compassion displayed by God's people, in the beauty and brilliance of God's creation? Will we recognize God's glory on display in the wine and in the cup as we come to the Lord's table? Will we respond like the disciples with belief? May we have eyes to see and to rejoice in the glory of Christ, the one who gives grace and life abundantly, the one who meets our every need, the one who created us and is saving us day after day. Amen.